Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, by Carroll Quigley. Chapter 19, The New Era, 1957 through 1964. The Growth of Nuclear Stalemate. The decade from 1953 to 1963 was the most critical in modern history. Man's ability to get through it successfully was a tribute to his good luck and good sense. The avoidance of nuclear war and the extraordinary burst of economic prosperity in the advanced industrial nations during that decade were balanced by the continued growth of acute social disorganization and the even more acute growth of ideological confusions. Nevertheless, man survived, and by 1963 was at the opening of a new era, based very largely on the relaxation of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, and on the opportunities to do something about the lagging social and intellectual problems provided by the combination of political relaxation and economic prosperity. The decade as a whole fell into two parts, divided about 1956. The first 3 years were marked by the continued race for the H-bomb, and covered the period from the early thermonuclear explosions in 1953 to the achievement of a fusion bomb that could be dropped from an airplane in 1956. The next 7 years were filled with the missile race, and reached their culmination and denouncement in the year from the Cuban Missile Crisis of October through November 1962 to the death of President Kennedy in November 1963. Closely related to this division, based on weapons development, was the somewhat delayed division of the decade into two parts by a change in American strategic policy. Here, the dividing point was about 1960 and is marked by the shift from the strategy of massive retaliation associated with the name of John Foster Dulles to the strategy of graduated deterrence associated with the new Democratic administration of President Kennedy. The shift in 1960, however, was only incidentally associated with the presidential election of that year and the subsequent shift of administration in the White House. The real change in 1960 was brought about, as we shall see, by the full achievement, at that time, of intercontinental thermonuclear striking ability by the two great superpowers. The balance of terror thus achieved by 1960 led directly to the missile crisis of 1962 and the thermonuclear stalemate of 1963. And these developments led to major changes in the political and ideological structures of all areas of the world, changes that are still going on. The shifting power balance. As we have seen, the whole period of 1953 to 1960 in the area of defense was dominated by the so-called New Look, the Republican effort to reduce the cost of the American defense effort by shifting from containment to massive retaliation. This involved a reduction in the American defense budget from an average of $43 billion a year over the last 4 Truman budgets, 1949 to 1953, to an average of $37.4 billion a year over the 6 Eisenhower budgets of 1954 to 1960. In this process, American military manpower was reduced from 3.7 million men to 2.5 million over the 6 years, January 1953 to January 1959. Foreign economic aid was decreasingly emphasized. In this fashion, the effort to deter Soviet aggression was based more completely on the threat of American nuclear attack by Strategic Air Command bombers on the Soviet homeland, and less on American readiness to meet Soviet forces on the ground or to win third powers to our side by economic or other aid. Dulles, who saw the world in black and white terms, refused to recognize the right of anyone to be neutral, and tried to force all states to join the American side in the Cold War or be condemned to exterior darkness. Having thus divided the world into two blocks, he sought to set up between them a continuous circuit of paper barriers along the land frontiers of the Soviet bloc from the Baltic Sea across Europe and Asia to the Far East. The chief portions in the barrier were the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in Europe, 1949, the Central Treaty Organization, 1953, in the Near East and Middle East, Centro, and the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, CETO, in the Far East, 1954. In theory, the paper barrier was made continuous by the presence of Turkey in both NATO and Centro, and Pakistan in both Centro and CETO. Dulles cared little about the military strength, economic prosperity, or political democracy of the states forming this paper ring around the Soviet bloc, since their chief function was to form a paper barrier so that any movement outward by Russia or its satellites by breaking the paper would trigger the tripwire circuit that hurled American nuclear retaliatory power on the Soviet homeland. In theory, this strategic policy meant that any outward movement by the Soviet Union or by one of its satellite states in some remote jungle or on some barren mountaintop of Central Asia might lead to all-out nuclear war, initiated by the United States, which would totally destroy European civilization as we know it. For until 1960, the ability of either of the superpowers to strike directly at the other from its own soil was very limited, and accordingly, the two superpowers had to strike from or strike at bases in Europe or the Far East. This change, which took place over the period 1956 to 1962, is of major significance, since it meant that the Soviet Union and the United States became capable of striking directly at each other and did not have to involve third powers in their disputes immediately. From the weapons point of view, it represented on the American side three changes. 1. The shift in manned bombing planes from the long-range B-47s to the intercontinental range B-52s and B-58s. And 2. The shift in missiles from the intermediate-range ballistic missiles, IRBMs, such as Thor or Jupiter, which had to be based in Turkey, Italy, or Britain in order to reach the Soviet Union, to intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, such as the Minuteman or Atlas, which could hit the Soviet Union from launching sites in the United States. And 3. The advent, about 1960, of the nuclear-propelled Polaris submarines, whose 16 nuclear-armed missiles could strike the Soviet Union from submerged positions in the seas bordering the Eurasian landmass. This American capability to strike the Soviet homeland from North America was not achieved so quickly or so completely on the Russian side, even by the time the nuclear stalemate had been reached in 1963. As a result, the Soviet Union could strike at the United States only by striking at its bases or its allies in NATO or in the Far East. At first, in the 1950s, such a Soviet counterstrike would have been largely by the Soviet ground forces invading westward across Central Europe. But by the late 1950s, as the Soviet strategic striking forces were strengthened by its acquisition of strategic bombing planes like the Tu-16 and of IRBMs, the Soviet counterstrike to America's massive retaliation would have resulted in the nuclear destruction and radioactive pollution of much of Europe. The gradual shift of American retaliatory power from intermediate range to intercontinental range in 1962 reduced the Soviet pressure on Europe by reducing the importance of America's European bases This had many significant implications for all the nations of Europe, both communist and Western. The key to the missile race rested on the fact that the United States and the Soviet Union took opposite routes in their efforts to obtain nuclear-armed rockets. One basic problem was how to combine the American A-bomb of 1945 with the German V-2 rocket, since the A-bomb was an egg-shaped object 5 feet wide and 10 feet long, which weighed 9,000 pounds, and the V-2 could carry a warhead of only 1,700 pounds, 200 miles. The problem was not easy. The Soviet government sought to close the gap between rocket power and nuclear payload by working toward a more powerful rocket, while the American scientists, over the opposition of the Air Force and the aviation industry, sought to close the gap by getting smaller bombs. The result of the race was that the Soviet Union in 1957 to 1962 had very large boosters, which gave it a lead in the race to propel objects into space or into ballistic orbits around the Earth. But these were very expensive, could not be made in large numbers, and were very awkward to install or to move. The United States, on the other hand, soon found it had bombs in all sizes, down to small ones capable of being used as tactical weapons by troops in ground combat, and able to be moved about on jeeps. As a consequence of the American decision to reduce the size of the bomb, a decision for which the great scientist Robert Oppenheimer was largely responsible, by the early 1960s, the United States was producing large numbers of warheads in a great variety of sizes, capable of being delivered by all kinds of vehicles, from tactical rockets and cannons up through Polaris missiles, airplanes of all sizes, and rockets of all ranges, up to city-destroying bombs carried by gigantic Strategic Air Command bombers, or ICBMs. Apparently, the Soviet success in obtaining the A-bomb in 1949, in destroying an A-bomb, in dropping an H-bomb in 1953, and in startling the world with its powerful rocket boosters in 1957, not only alarmed the United States, but also lulled the Kremlin itself into the mistaken idea that it was ahead of the United States in the development of missile nuclear weapons. This so-called missile gap was a mistaken idea, for the vast expanse of American production of nuclear materials began in 1950, combined with a simultaneous reduction in the sizes of nuclear warheads by 1959, was bringing the United States into a condition of nuclear plenty and of overkill capacity that posed a grim problem for the Soviet Union. It was, strangely enough, just at that time, end of 1957, that two American studies, the Gaither Report and the Special Studies Project of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, suggested the existence of a missile gap, or inferiority in missile capacity of the United States compared to the Soviet Union. This judgment, apparently based on overemphasis on the size of Soviet rocket boosters, played a chief role in the American presidential campaign of 1960 and in the ebullient self-confidence of Khrushchev and his associates in 1957 to 1961. The reality of the situation apparently was not recognized in Moscow until 1961, when it penetrated with a cold shock of fear through the deceptive festivities of self-congratulations that had begun with the success of Sputnik 1, October 1957, and the successful moonshot, Lunik 2, of September 1959. In this pleasant period of self-deception, intensified by the American presidential campaign's unrealistic discussion of the missile gap, in 1960, the Kremlin entered upon an unofficial international suspension of nuclear bomb testing, the test moratorium, from October 31, 1958 to October 23, 1961. Suddenly, in 1961, the The Soviet authorities recognized that they had fallen far behind the United States, both in number and in variety of nuclear weapons, because their existing nuclear bombs were too large for many purposes, especially for accurate and numerous long-range ICBMs. Accordingly, in October 1961, the Soviet Union broke the test moratorium of 3 years by resuming nuclear testing. But to conceal the purpose of the tests in seeking smaller bombs, they aimed their publicity on the tests at the fact that they exploded the largest bomb ever used, a 58-megaton fusion thermonuclear monstrosity. After these tests, it soon became clear to the Soviet Union that the American lead in ICBMs could not be overcome by the Soviet Union. In view of its limited industrial capacity and the other urgent demands on that capacity, in any period of time that had strategic meaning. Accordingly, Moscow, probably at the instigation of the Red Army itself, decided to remedy its weakness in ICBMs by seeking to move some of its numerous ICBMs within range of the United States by secretly installing them in Castro's Cuba. This decision, if we have analyzed it correctly, showed once again the way in which the Soviet defense strategy moved in a direction opposite to that which was influencing American defense decisions. Just at the time, summer 1962, that the Soviet Union was deciding to remedy its weakness in ICBMs by trying to install IRBMs in a third power close to the United States, the latter was deciding that its supply of ICBMs was increasing so rapidly that it would close down its IRBM bases in third countries close to the Soviet Union, such as Turkey. This American decision was already beginning to be carried out when the Cuban Missile Crisis broke in October 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a turning point in Soviet-American relations, similar in some ways to the Fashoda Crisis in 1898 between France and England. It showed both sides that neither wanted a war and that their interests were not antithetical on all points. Thus it signaled the suspension of the Cold War and the all-out insane armaments race between them. It showed that the United States had missile superiority sufficient to veto any major Soviet aggression, while the Soviet Union had sufficient missile power in combination with the generally non-aggressive American attitude to discourage the United States from using its missile superiority to make any aggression on the Soviet Union. Thus was established a nuclear or power stalemate of nuclear vetoes between the United States and the Soviet Union that secured each against the other. The American-Soviet stalemate, by inhibiting the use of the power of each, permitted third powers to escape, to a considerable extent, from the need to have power sufficient to back up their actions. This meant that third states could undertake actions which their own power could not in itself justify or enforce. That is to say, that the superpower stalemate allowed third states a freedom of action beyond their own intrinsic powers. Thus, Indonesia could attack Malaya, China could attack India, Pakistan, although allied to the United States, could be cozy with Red China, Cyprus could defy Turkey, Egypt could attack Yemen, France could defy the United States, Romania could flirt with Peking, and Britain or Spain could trade with Castro's Cuba, without the superpowers feeling free to use their own real strengths to obtain what they wanted, since most of these strengths were neutralized opposing each other. One significant consequence of this situation was the almost total collapse of the system of international law that had been formulated in the 17th century by the work of writers like Grotius. That system of international law had regarded the state as the embodiment of sovereignty, an organization of political power on a territorial basis. The criteria for the existence of such a sovereign state had been its ability to defend its boundaries against external aggression and to maintain law and public order among its inhabitants inside those boundaries. By 1964, as a consequence of the power stalemate of the Cold War, dozens of states, such as the Congo, which could perform neither of these actions, were recognized as states by the superpowers and their allies, and achieved this recognition in international law by being admitted to the United Nations. This development culminated over 50 years of destruction of the old established distinctions of international law, such as the distinctions between war and peace, destroyed by the Cold War, which was neither, between belligerents and neutrals, destroyed by British economic warfare in World War I, or between civilians and combatants, destroyed by submarine warfare and city bombing. Nuclear stalemate in the Cold War context made it possible for political organizations with almost none of the traditional characteristics of a state not only to be recognized as states, but to act in irresponsible ways and to survive on economic subsidy won from one bloc by threatening to join or merely to accept subsidies from the other bloc. As a consequence of this situation, all the realities of international affairs by 1964 had become covered with thick layers of law, theories, practices, and agreements that had no relationship to reality at all. Today, the pressure of the realities beneath that layer to break through it and emerge into the daylight, where they can be generally recognized, has reached a critical point. As part of that process of increasing sanity, which the recognition of reality always is, the future of disarmament became more hopeful than it had been in decades, although the chances of reaching any substantial disarmament agreements remain slight. This means that disarmament is more likely to appear in the form of nuclear disengagement and tacit adoption of parallel actions than in the form of explicit agreements or signed documents. The amount of myth and false theories that must be pushed aside to permit even the highest peaks of reality to emerge is very large. In the United Nations alone, it involves such points as the recognition of the Congo as a state, the belief that Taiwan is a great power worthy of one of the 4 permanent veto-wielding seats on the Security Council, or the pretense that Red China, in spite of its possession of all the traditional attributes of statehood, does not exist. Part of this return to reality is embodied in the growing recognition that there are more situations in which the United States and the Soviet Union have parallel interests than there are in which their interests are antithetical. Certainly, they have a common interest in avoiding nuclear war, in preventing the spread of nuclear weapons to additional states, in not poisoning the atmosphere with radioactive fallout from nuclear testing, in slowing up weapons development, technological rivalry, and the space race, in order to direct more resources to domestic problems of poverty, social disorganization, and education, or in refraining from outbidding each other in grants of arms and aid to unreliable, ungrateful, unstable, and inefficient neutralist regimes. One first clear evidence of recognition of this common interest was the peaceful settlement of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but the first formal agreement based on it was the official Test Ban Treaty of August 1963. This treaty not only aimed to maintain the stalemate between the two superpowers to the degree that it might be jeopardized by their future testing, it also sought to hamper the spread of nuclear weapons to additional powers by this restriction. Both superpowers and many neutrals feared that nuclear explosives would get into the control of Red China or other irresponsible hands. By the late 1960s, considerations such as these revealed that there were considerable areas of common interests among the states of the world covering all 3 groups of the so-called free world, the communist bloc and the neutrals. The net result was the almost total disappearance of the world as seen by John Foster Dulles only a decade before. The two-power world of Dulles was being replaced by a multi-block world in which the two superpowers, instead of being antithetical on all points, were finding large areas in which their interests were closer to each other than they were to those of some of the other newer blocks, especially that growing up around Red China. Moreover, as we shall see, in some of the ways, the aims, methods, and structures of the two superpowers were converging on increasingly parallel courses. Most obviously, repugnant to Dulles would have been the rise of neutralism, evident not only in the increasing numbers and independence of the neutral states, but in the disintegration of both the old superpower blocks as these weakened and dissolved, and former members of these, such as France in the West and Romania in the East, adopted increasingly neutralistic policies. As one obvious consequence of this, the paper groupings and barriers Dulles had so painfully constructed in the 1950s were under liquidation as one of the chief tasks of the 1960s. This was evident with increasing obviousness in NATO, the Organization of American States, OAS, Centro, and CETO. Less obviously, except in the Far East, the same disintegrative process has been going on within the Soviet bloc, at first with Yugoslavia in 1948, and then with Red China in 1960, Albania, Romania, and others. This whole process of growing neutralism, diversity, and the disintegration of the superblocks, followed by the increasing emphasis of all groups on the problems of poverty, social disorganization, and spiritual nihilism, was possible only because of the growth of nuclear stalemate, and must, throughout, be recognized as occurring under the umbrella of thermonuclear terror and the danger from new, equally horrible biological weapons.